The Battle of Carillon, also known as the 1758 Battle of Ticonderoga, was fought on July 8, 1758, during the French and Indian War. It was fought near Fort Carillon on the shore of Lake Champlain in the frontier area between the British colony of New York and the French colony of Canada. In the battle, which took place primarily on a rise about 3/4 of a mile from the fort itself, a French army of about 3,600 men under General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm and the Chevalier de Lévis decisively defeated an overwhelmingly numerically superior force of British troops under General James Abercrombie, which frontally assaulted an entrenched French position without using field artillery, a lack that left the British and its allies vulnerable and allowed the French to win a decisive victory. The battle was the bloodiest of the war, with over 3,000 casualties suffered. French losses were about 400, while more than 2,000 were British. American historian Lawrence Henry Gibson wrote of Abercrombie's campaign that no military campaign was ever launched on American soil that involved a greater number of errors of judgment on the part of those in positions of responsibility. Many military historians have cited the Battle of Carillon as a classic example of tactical military incompetence. Abercrombie, confident of a quick victory, ignored several viable military options, such as flanking the French breastworks, waiting for his artillery, or laying siege to the fort. Instead, relying on a flawed report from a young military engineer, and ignoring some of that engineer's recommendations, he decided in favor of a direct frontal assault on the thoroughly entrenched French, without the benefit of artillery. Montcalm, while concerned about the weak military position of the fort, conducted the defense with spirit. However, due in part to a lack of time, he committed strategic errors in preparing the area's defenses that a competent attacker could have exploited, and he made tactical errors that made the attacker's job easier. The fort, abandoned by its garrison, was captured by the British the following year, and it has been known as Fort Ticonderoga ever since. This battle gave the fort a reputation for impregnability that had an effect on future military operations in the area. Despite several large-scale military movements through the area, in both the French and Indian War and the American Revolutionary War, this was the only major battle fought near the fort's location. Geography. Fort Carillon is situated on a point of land between Lake Champlain and Lake George, at a natural point of conflict between French forces moving south from Canada and the St. Lawrence River Valley across the lake toward the Hudson Valley, and British forces moving up the Hudson from Albany. The fort was sited with Lake Champlain to the east, with Mount Independence rising on the far side. Immediately to the south of the fort lay the mouth of the Lachute River, which drains Lake George. The river was largely non-navigable, and there was a portage trail from the northern end of Lake George to the location of a sawmill the French had built to assist in the fort's construction. The trail crossed the Lachute twice, once about 2 miles from Lake George, and again at the sawmill, which was about 2 miles from the fort. To the north of the fort was a road going to Fort St. Frédéric. To the west was a low rise of land, beyond which lay Mount Hope, a rise that commanded part of the portage trail, but was too far from the fort to pose it any danger. The most serious geographic defect in the fort's location was Mount Defiance, which lay to the south of the fort, across the Lachute River. This 900-foot hill, which was steep and densely forested, provided an excellent firing position for cannon aimed at the fort. Nicolas Sarrebourg de Pontleroy, Montcalm's chief engineer, said of the fort's site, "Were I to be entrusted with the siege of it, I should require only 6 mortars and 2 cannon." Background. Prior to 1758, the French and Indian War had gone very poorly for the British, whose military met few of its objectives. Following a string of French victories in 1757 in North America, coupled with military setbacks in Europe, William Pitt gained full control of the direction of British military efforts in the 7 Years' War, embarking on a strategy that emphasized defense in Europe, where France was strong, and defense in North America, where France was weak. He resolved to attack New France in 3 strategic campaigns. Large-scale campaigns were planned to capture Fort Duquesne on the Pennsylvania frontier and the fortress at Louisburg. The third campaign, assigned to General James Abercrombie, was to launch an attack against Canada through the Champlain Valley. Pitt probably would have preferred to have George Howe, a skilled tactician and a dynamic leader, lead this expedition, but seniority and political considerations led him to appoint the relatively undistinguished Abercrombie instead. Howe was appointed a brigadier general, and placed as Abercrombie's second-in-command. The French, who had started construction on Fort Carillon in 1755, used it as a launching point for the successful siege of Fort William Henry in 1757. Despite that and other successes in North America in 1757, the situation did not look good for them in 1758. As early as March, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, the commanding general responsible of the French forces in North America, and the Marquis de Vaudreuil, New France's governor, were aware that the British were planning to send large numbers of troops against them, and that they would have relatively little support from King Louis XV of France. The lack of support from France was in large part due to an unwillingness of the French military to risk the movement of significant military forces across the Atlantic Ocean, which was dominated by Britain's Royal Navy. This situation was further exacerbated by Canada's poor harvest in 1757, which resulted in food shortages as the winter progressed. Montcalm and Vaudreuil, who did not get along with each other, differed on how to deal with the British threat. They had fewer than 5,000 regular troops, an estimated 6,000 militiamen, and a limited number of Indian allies to bring against British forces reported to number 50,000. Vaudreuil, who had limited combat experience, wanted to divide the French forces, with about 5,000 each at Carillon and Louisburg, and then send a picked force of about 3,500 men against the British in the Mohawk River on the northwestern frontiers of the province of New York. Montcalm believed this to be folly, as the plan would enable the British to easily divert some of their forces to fend off the French attack. Vaudreuil prevailed, and in June 1758 Montcalm left Quebec for Carillon. British preparations. The British amassed their army, under the command of General James Abercrombie, near the remains of Fort William Henry, which lay at the southern end of Lake George but had been destroyed following its capture by the French the previous year. The army numbered fully 16,000 men, making it the largest single force ever deployed in North America at the time. Its complement of 6,000 regular troops included Lord John Murray's Highlanders of the 42nd Highland Regiment, the 27th, 44th, 46th, and 55th Regiments, and the 1st and 4th Battalions of the 60th, while the provinces providing militia support included Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. On July 5, 1758, these troops embarked on boats, which unloaded them at the north end of Lake George on July 6. French defensive preparations. Colonel François-Charles de Bourlamaque, in command of Fort Carillon prior to Montcalm's arrival, knew by June 23 that a major British offensive was about to begin. He had sent a messenger bearing a letter from Vaudreuil to Abercrombie on June 10, expecting him to return. The fact that the British held him was an indication that the messenger had probably learned too much just by being in the British camp. Bourlamaque increased scouting activities, and learned from captured British scouts the approximate size of the British force. Montcalm arrived at Fort Carillon on June 30, and found there a significantly understaffed garrison, with only 3,500 men, and food sufficient for only 9 days. Bourlamaque's scouts reported that the British had 20,000 or more troops massing near the remains of Fort William Henry. Given the large force facing him and the defects of the fort's site, Montcalm opted for a strategy of defending the likely approaches to the fort. He immediately detached Bourlamaque and 3 battalions to occupy and fortify the river crossing on the portage trail about 2 miles from the northern end of Lake George, about 6 miles from the fort. Montcalm himself took 2 battalions and occupied and fortified an advance camp at the sawmill, while remaining troops were put to work preparing additional defenses outside the fort. He also sent word back to Montreal of the situation, requesting that, if possible, the Chevalier de Reliacut-Vies and his men be sent his reinforcement. These were troops that Vaudreuil intended for duty at the western frontier forts. Reliacut-Vies had not yet left Montreal, so Vaudreuil instead ordered him and 400 troops to Carillon. They departed Montreal on July 2. When word reached Bourlamaque on July 5 that the British fleet was coming, he sent Captain Trépezé and about 350 men to observe the fleet, and, if possible, to prevent their landing. On learning the size of the British fleet, which was reportedly large enough to cover the face of Lake George, Montcalm ordered Bourlamaque to retreat. Bourlamaque, who was satisfied with his defensive situation, resisted, not withdrawing until Montcalm repeated the orders 3 times. Montcalm, now aware of the scope of the movement, ordered all of the troops back to Carillon, and had both bridges on the portage trail destroyed. These withdrawals isolated Trépezé and his men from the main body, a situation made worse for Trépezé when his Indian guides, alarmed by the size of the British fleet, abandoned him. Beginning on the evening of July 6, the French began to lay out entrenchments on the rise northwest of the fort, about 0.75 miles away, that commanded the land routes to the fort. On July 7, they constructed a lengthy series of abatis below these entrenchments. By the end of that day, they had also constructed a wooden breastwork above the trenches. These hastily erected defences, while proof against small arms fire, would have been ineffective if the British had used cannons against them. The Nets Brook. The British Army began an unopposed landing at the north end of Lake George on the morning of July 6. Abercrombie first landed an advance force to check the area where the forces were to disembark, and found it recently deserted. Some supplies and equipment had been left behind by the French in their hasty departure. The bulk of the army landed, formed into columns, and attempted to march up the west side of the stream that connected Lake George to Lake Champlain, rather than along the portage trail, whose bridges Montcalm had destroyed. However, the wood was very thick, and the columns could not be maintained. Near the area where the Nets Brook enters the La Chute, Captain Trépezé and his troop, who were attempting to return to the French lines, encountered Phineas Lyman's Connecticut regiment, sparking a skirmish in the woods. General Howe's column was near the action, so he led it in that direction. As they approached the battle scene, General Howe was hit and instantly killed by a musket ball. A column of Massachusetts provincials, also drawn to the battle, cut off the French patrol's rear. In desperate fighting, about 150 of Trépezé's men were killed, and another 150 were captured. 50 men, including Trépezé, escaped by swimming across the La Chute. Trépezé died the next day of wounds suffered in the battle. Sources disagree on the number of casualties suffered. William Nestor claims British casualties were light, only 10 dead and 6 wounded, while René Chartrand claims that there were about 100 killed and wounded, including the loss of General Howe. The British, frustrated by the difficult woods, demoralized by Howe's death, and exhausted from the overnight boat ride, camped in the woods, and returned to the landing point early the next morning. Portage Road. On July 7, Abercrombie sent Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet and a sizable force down the portage path. On reaching the first crossing, where Bourlamaque had camped, they rebuilt the bridge there, and proceeded on to the Sawmill crossing. The army then followed, and set up its camp there. Scouts and prisoners reported to Abercrombie that Montcalm had 6,000 men and was expecting the Chevalier de Reilly-Écoute-Vis to arrive at any moment with 3,000 reinforcements. Abercrombie ordered his engineer, Lieutenant Matthew Clark, and one of his aides, Captain James Abercrombie, to reconnoiter the French defences. After ascending Rattlesnake Hill, they reported that the French position appeared to be incomplete, and could be easily forced, even without cannon. They were unaware that the French had disguised much of the works with shrubs and trees, and that they were in fact largely complete. Clark's report included recommendations to fortify both the summit and the base of Rattlesnake Hill. Abercrombie decided that they had to attack the next morning, hopefully before Reilly-Écoute-Vis and his supposed 3,000 arrived. Reilly-Écoute-Vis arrived at the fort on the evening of July 7 with his troop of 400 regulars. Abercrombie held a war council that evening. The options he presented to his staff were limited to asking if the next day's attack should be in 3 ranks or 4. The council opted for 3. Abercrombie's plan of attack omitted Clark's recommendation to fortify the summit of Rattlesnake Hill, in addition to the frontal assault. 4 6-pound guns and a howitzer were to be floated down the La Chute River and mounted at the base of Rattlesnake Hill, with 20 bateaux of troops to support the effort. Early on the morning of July 8, Clark went out once again to the base of Rattlesnake Hill to observe the French defences. His report indicated that he still felt the French lines could be taken by assault. Battle lines form. The battle began on the morning of July 8 with Rogers Rangers and light infantry from Colonel Thomas Gage's 80th Regiment of Light Armed Foot, pushing the few remaining French scouts behind the entrenchments. They were followed by provincials from New York and Massachusetts, and then 3 columns of regulars, who made their way through the provincial formations to begin the attack. The 27th and 60th made up the right column, under the command of the 27th SLT Col. William Haviland. The 44th and 55th under LT Col. John Donaldson made the center, and the 42nd and 46th under the 42nd SLT Col. Francis Grant formed the left column. Each column was preceded by the regimental light infantry companies. Held in reserve were provincial regiments from Connecticut and New Jersey. Montcalm had organized the French forces into 3 brigades and a reserve. He commanded the Royal Roussillon and Berry battalions in the center of the entrenchments, while Reilly-Écoute-Vis commanded the Reilly-Écoute-Arn, Guyenne, and La Reine battalions on the right, and Bourlamaque led the La Sarre and Languedoc battalions on the left. Each battalion was given roughly 100 yards of the entrenchment to defend. Redoubts with cannon protected the flanks of the entrenchments, although the one on the right had not been completed. The low ground between the left flank and the La Chute River was guarded by militia and marines, who had also constructed abattis to help protect their position. Reserve forces were either in the fort itself, or on the grounds between the fort and the entrenchments on Mount Hope. Portions of each battalion were also held in reserve to assist in areas where they might be needed.